It's The Real News. I'm Aaron Mate. This is part 2 with Norman Finkelstein and Jamie Stern-Weiner. We're talking about the so-called anti-Semitism controversy that is engulfing Jeremy Corbyn and the British Labour Party. His critics, especially inside the party, as well as prominent Jewish groups, are accusing Corbyn of a litany of so-called anti-Semitism charges. And we're talking to Jamie and Norman about how actually, in their view, this is a weapon to undermine Corbyn's progressive agenda and his staunch support for basic Palestinian human rights. So in this section, in this part, we're going to address some of the key developments that have been used in this effort against Corbyn. And I want to start with this controversy, so-called controversy about a dinner, about an event that Corbyn hosted in 2010, which featured a survivor of the Nazi Holocaust. And at that event, this survivor compared Israeli policies on the Gaza Strip, the besiegement of the Gaza Strip, to those of Nazi Germany. And Corbyn has recently been pilloried for appearing at that event and failing to properly criticize that speaker. So I want to go to a clip. This is Richard Millett. He is a prominent blogger in Britain on Jewish culture and Jewish life. And he spoke to Britain's Channel 4 News.
I just wanted to let one point of view reign and for everyone else to be quiet. And I think in the Houses of Parliament, where you hear the debate from all sides, I think it's very wrong just to, in any of these meetings like this, to hear such a one-sided panel.
What do you think Jeremy Corbyn should have done?
To have said, this is disagreeable what I'm hearing, but let's just let him finish and then you can make your comments.
That's Richard Millett speaking about this 2010 event that Jeremy Corbyn chaired. So Norman, if you could talk about this case, the Holocaust survivor in question, Ajo Meyer, he died in 2014. So he's no longer around now to defend himself against these charges and him, by association, being accused of anti-Semitism. But I'm wondering if you could speak to what he was talking about back then and then what Corbyn's critics are saying about him now.
I don't know the exact details on what Ajo Meyer said. I do know him. I did know him. We met when I was in the Netherlands. I had a dinner with him. And I have mutual friends who know him quite well and who knew him quite well and held him in the very highest regard. And these are friends whose moral judgment I respect a lot. Meyer was the real thing. He was in Auschwitz. And he then wanted to use, in the positive sense, he wanted to exploit, in the positive sense, his own horrific experience to embrace those who are now coming under murderous assault, who are now suffering, and who, what's worse, were being victimized in the name of and justified by the experience he passed through. Now, I think there are a couple of things to say. Number one, Israel all the time makes comparisons between its enemies and the Nazis. We all remember Saddam, Hitler. For those whose memories go back to the 1950s, it was Nasser Hitler. Those whose memories don't stretch far back, they'll remember as early as yesterday, we hear Iran Hitler. We hear all the time from Mr. Netanyahu that Iran is worse than the Nazis. He said the Nazis wanted only to conquer Europe, whereas Iran wants to conquer the world, that they're worse than the Nazis. And then we're told the Palestinians are worse than the Nazis. It was no lesser a person than Netanyahu, Prime Minister of Israel. He said the idea of the final solution, the extermination of the Jews, it was dreamt up not by Hitler. He said Hitler didn't want to kill the Jews. The idea was dreamt up by the Palestinian leader, the Mufti of Jerusalem. So it's a little bit odd, not to say grossly hypocritical, to suddenly ostracize and demonize and chastise Jeremy Corbyn for being in the presence of an Auschwitz survivor who says that Israeli policies in some aspects and some regards bear an eerie resemblance to some of the things he experienced in the rise of the Nazi regime. But not a word, never a word of criticism when the same sorts of comparisons are routinely hurled by Israel's apologists. Just one amusing footnote. 2 days ago, I appeared on a debate on Iran television with none other than the person you just had on, Richard Millett. I was kind of astonished. Every word out of his mouth was Hamas Hitler, Hamas Nazis, Gaza Hitler, Gaza Nazis. Every word. I didn't know what this guy is talking about. But that all passes muster in the mainstream media. But when a survivor of Auschwitz uses his suffering in order to protect, to embrace those who are now suffering a 12-year-long murderous blockade, that somehow becomes a sin in the current media atmosphere.
Right, Norman. So before I go back to Jamie, this speaks to another controversy, so-called controversy around Corbin and Labor, because they've been criticized for not, by prominent Jewish groups and centrist members of their parties, for not fully adopting what's known as the Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's definition of anti-Semitism. Labor rejected some parts that would essentially equate criticism of Israel to anti-Semitism, that would essentially define anti-Semitism that way. And Labor is being attacked for that. I'm wondering if you could talk about what's going on there.
Okay, I'll try to be brief because the controversy has become so contrived. There's a definition of anti-Semitism put out by this organization called the IHRA, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. This definition has a very murky history. If you're interested and your viewers are interested, they should consult an article by Stephen Smedley in the London Review of Books. But leaving the history aside, number one, everybody agrees, all commentators agree, the definition itself is completely worthless. It talks about a certain perception that might be expressed but might not be expressed. As numerous legal experts, policymakers have commented, this definition has zero heuristic value. It provides no legal guidance, no practical guidance, no policy guidance. Number two, after they cite this positively weird definition, they then give what they call 11 illustrations or examples of anti-Semitism. Lo and behold, of the 11 examples they give, 7 of the 11 have nothing to do with anti-Semitism, but have everything to do with criticizing Israel. Now, in my opinion, and here I'm speaking strictly for myself, the British Labour Party, or one of its divisions, the NEC, it adopted large swathes, wide swathes of the IHRA definition. I think that was stupid. I think it was politically unwise. But in fact, they adopted virtually the whole of this very suspect IHRA definition. They expressed reservations about a few clauses. And apparently now, from what I've read in the last couple of days, everything hinges on one particular clause. And the clause reads, denying the Jewish people their right to self-determination, for example, claiming that the existence of a state of Israel is a racist endeavor. Now, that's an example of anti-Semitism. If you claim that Israel or its founding was a racist endeavor. And Jeremy Corbyn refuses to abandon that issue as of now. He won't adopt that as being inherently an anti-Semitic claim. So I ask you, and I ask your viewers, a simple question. The leading historian on the Israel-Palestine conflict, the leading Israeli historian, is Benny Morris. Now, in his classic work, or the revised version of his classic work, he states that the idea of transfer, what we call ethnic cleansing, the idea of transfer, he says, was inbuilt and inevitable in Zionism. In Zionism, inbuilt and inevitable in Zionism. Then you have Ari Shavet, who was until recently the dean of Israeli liberal commentators.
Until he was accused of sexual harassment, yeah.
Yeah. But until then, he had a very weighty position in Israeli society. And he too said it was impossible to create the state of Israel unless there had been an ethnic cleansing. So he writes, quote, if Zionism was to be, Lead, that was one of the major Arab cities, could not be. If Zionism was to be, Lead could not be. Transfer was inbuilt and inherent in Zionism. So by the reckoning of the IHRA definition, both Benny Morris and Ari Shavet would be guilty of anti-Semitism for saying what's quite obviously a commonplace.
Mm-hmm. All right. So before we wrap, I want to play a clip of Jeremy Corbyn. So Norman mentions how Jeremy Corbyn is standing his ground on this clause related to anti-Semitism. But under this heavy pressure, he has made statements, including acknowledging, he says, anti-Semitism inside the Labour Party, and also apologizing for if people feel upset by his appearance at that 2010 event with the Holocaust survivors. So I want to play a clip of Jeremy Corbyn's video to the British people addressing this anti-Semitism controversy.
People who use anti-Semitic poison need to understand you do not do it in my name or the name of my party. You are not our supporters. And anyone who denies that this has surfaced within our party is clearly actually wrong and contributing to the problem.
So that's Jeremy Corbyn. Jamie Stern-Weiner, as we wrap, is this campaign against Corbyn, is it working? I mentioned in part one how you had 3 leading Jewish newspapers publish a joint editorial calling Corbyn an existential threat to the Jewish people. You have just preparing for this segment, just looking at the news, headline after headline, linking Corbyn to anti-Semitism. The Guardian, a supposed liberal newspaper, dozens of articles and op-eds calling on Corbyn to address this crisis, calling his leadership into question. Is this campaign working amongst the broader public?
Well, first, just to note that Corbyn's apology, at least in its written version, was careful to note that the number of cases of anti-Semitism that have been referred to the disciplinary committee within Labour comprise less than 0.1% of the membership. Now, as for whether or not the campaign is working, there's no evidence that it's affecting the broader vote for Corbyn. Even among Jews, it may have slightly reduced the level of support, but most British Jews anyway would not have voted for Corbyn. They The Jewish vote for Labour declined significantly already under Ed Miliband, and they weren't going to vote for Corbyn anyway. So among that minority of British Jews who support Corbyn, my impression is few have been taken in by this smear campaign. And those Jews who do believe the allegations weren't going to support him anyway. Now, I don't think that means that it's not having any negative effect. This constant drumbeat forces the leadership to be in firefighting mode, has to be on the defensive all the time, rather than pushing forward its own vision for transforming society. So there's an opportunity cost there. It's also been demoralizing for the membership. It's very, not just infuriating, but disorienting when you consider yourself and are an anti-racist activist who just got involved in progressive politics to try and transform this country in a more fair, more equal, more just direction, to now be accused of anti-Semitism. So it's having a demoralizing effect. But I have to say, I think the sheer volume of allegations and the sheer ridiculousness and manifest cynicism of some of them, like the allegation pertaining to the Jewish survivor of Auschwitz that Norman just discussed, I think it's beginning to have create a backlash. And I think people are learning this is what happens when you try to elect a principled socialist, principled supporter of the oppressed into power. They're going to come under this kind of coordinated assault. And in that sense, it's been a good political education.
We'll leave it there. I want to thank my guests for joining us. Jamie Stern-Weiner, graduate student at the University of Oxford, editor of Moment of Truth, Tackling Israel-Palestine's Toughest Questions, and Norman Finkelstein, author and scholar, his latest book, Gaza, An Inquest into Its Martyrdom. Thanks to you both.
Thanks.
And thank you for joining us on The Real News.